Healthcare Incorporated is the industry. It's all of the stakeholders that we've listened to over the last couple of days. The regulators, the health providers, the industry. Is the patient, are we benefiting the patient? Yes or no? Is it working? Second question, what must we change? Third question, what's stopping us? So I'd like to invite Gino to start that debate. And then as we go through, please, any questions, put your hand up, usual format, because everybody benefits from this. You know, we are suffocating with complexity, particularly in the operational field, and it's getting to unsustainable levels, and we've got to do something about it if we want to get up from the canvas. Okay, Gino.
Okay, thank you, Martin. And yeah, I'm here on behalf of Pete Milligan, who is a colleague of mine at Roche, who unfortunately couldn't make it today. So I think in the previous session I gave some background to myself, so I'll explain again for those who are not in the last session. I used to work for Glaxo, I'm a registered pharmacist, and then 4 or 5 years ago I became Professor of Innovation at King's College London. And then just recently I've moved back into industry, working for Roche. Still got my chair at King's, and I think that's a good example of, I think one of the solutions actually of what I call fluid boundaries. I think we need to see people moving backwards and forwards from different sectors, particularly academia and industry, and back again. I think that's one of the things our industry has been very bad at, is encouraging cross-fertilization of skills and sectors. So I'm going to talk about this in different ways, certainly with my academic head and my old industrial head. One thing I will say, I'm going to contradict Martin a little bit. I mean, I did say I was going to do this about antibiotics, and August the 4th, 2015 is a very, very hard day for me. It's the day my father passed away, very severe diabetic, had a leg amputated. He had a very difficult couple of years of his life, but he actually died of sepsis of the gallbladder. Okay. 5 weeks later, childminder, she's only 54, her husband was 57. He died of pneumonia, or a complicated infection of pneumonia. I'll probably wager right now, if we looked at 100 certificate deaths in hospitals in and around the UK, I think the defined cause of death of sepsis or some kind of complicated infection will be on there for a majority of those certificate deaths. So I think it's happening now, Martin. I don't think we're actually reporting it very well, but I certainly think people are passing away from certainly gram-negative infections. So, and it's difficult for me because I see Trevor in the audience, and he'll know SmithKline Beecham, the legacy we had in antibiotics, the Wellcome Trust, and what you guys did over there. We were centres of excellence for antibiotics, and we just we kind of just lost all that competence, all that skill base. It just suddenly evaporated. I'm still privileged to know a guy called Pat Crowley, who mentioned on the market. He's 71, runs marathons, lives in Philadelphia now. And, I know what he did and how many lives he saved. And it's a real shocker for me. Certainly when it comes to catastrophes, we should protect our initial database. And one of the things I worry about with Brexit, in particular, that we lose some more people with a brain drain. And that's something we should try to protect and harvest. So it pains me to see the antibiotic pipelines the way they are. I mean, they are getting better, Martin, a lot more than you think. So there's a lot more activity on there right now, but we should do a lot more. So sorry about the negative bit, but it's I think it is. I think people are dying of antibiotic infections and antibacterial infections. Okay, is it working? Well, if you read the OECD data, and this is a very important bit of data because it shocks everybody, because I mentioned this to the Dean of Medicine at King's, that actually, if you look at it, pound for pound, as an organisation, the NHS is seen as most efficient delivery of medicines to patients than all the other healthcare providers in the world. I can't believe it, but apparently it's there, and I've seen that data a number of times now. My own personal perspective, I think the intent is there. I think the execution is probably not the best, and I always use the quote of Eric Morecambe: we're playing all the right notes, but maybe not necessarily in the right order. What do we need to change? I think we've got to make things simpler. I think when I came back into industry, what really shocked me, and I really mean it, really shocked me, was the difficulty it was for me, as an academic, to suddenly ring up the phone and speak to, say, Richard Trembath, the Dean of Medicine, because now he's a healthcare professional. And it's very difficult now, if you're working in the pharmaceutical industry, to engage in an active conversation, discussion with healthcare professionals. You've got to be careful what you say. You've got to be careful. If you buy them a coffee, buy them a bottle of water, you can be in serious trouble doing something like that. How is that going to help the engagement process and the active collaboration between like-minded individuals? And I think that's going to have to change, making the environment a lot more easier to discuss science in a friendly way, to encourage that connectivity between HCPs and the industry. And I think Mark Dumont in the previous session said, that's one thing he's noticed as a patient, that he doesn't want to, he can't understand why he can't actively talk to the pharma industry. He can't understand why on packaging there's not more information about who to contact in certain areas. And that's a patient giving that, not my view. What is stopping us? To be honest with you, I don't know what's stopping us, Martin. But I think clearly enough pivot points have occurred in the last couple of months that we have to do something pretty radical. And I'll pass over to Steve.
Great. Thanks, Gino. Steve?
Yes, good afternoon. I suppose it's very difficult for me to actually comment as such about the pharma industry because I work for BT. I'm not working in the life sciences part of BT, but I work in the research unit. And my research theme is looking at organisational effectiveness. So what I'm trying to do is to make BT what would have been considered many, many years ago as a very, very large monolith. I want to make BT a lot more agile in the way that it responds to its environment. Okay? So what I've been doing over the past 3 or 4 years is developing various tool sets. I was speaking to I think Martin just yesterday, and I was saying to Martin, the purpose of the system is what it does. It seems such an obvious statement, but when you think about it, if it takes BT 20 years to turn something around, it's been designed that way. Whether that design is conscious or not doesn't make any difference. Okay, it's the purpose of the system is what it does. Okay, so we're trying to change what it does. Right, the only way of being able to change something that's with anything is to be able to understand it. So my first challenge for BT is really trying to understand ourselves. And that brings me back to a situation a number of years ago when I was reflecting on my career and trying to understand what was going on in relation to a term I think we use all the time, which is complexity. When I was young, I had a motorbike, and to me, the motorbike was complex. I couldn't understand it, and that was why it was complex. But after a while, I would get used to understanding how it was working, and I would no longer feel intimidated. I built mental models of a motorbike, and indeed, if I drew a picture of a motorbike on the screen, I think everybody would recognise that's a motorbike. I could do the same for a car. A car could be a wee bit more complex. I used to be a marine engineer many years, so it's the same for a ship. A ship would be a bit more complex. I could draw a picture of a ship on the wall, and we'd recognise that as a ship. A number of years later, I started working for BT, and I was in charge of the northeast of England for the services that we deliver for our customers. And I was starting now to be able to get confused. I thought, well, I can no longer show someone a motorbike. I want to show someone an organisation, because what I want to do is I want to be able to improve the way that the organisation is performing. One of the jobs I had at the time is that I was in charge of the public payphone service. And the payphone service we were delivering to our customers was pretty poor. Pretty low, I won't say what it was. But there was a target to be able to increase it. Ian Vallance gave us a target to be able to increase payphone serviceability to 95%. And that was a very significant increase. So my challenge is I wasn't fixing the payphones directly myself, and I had this thing called an organisation that was in between me and the payphones. So I thought, what's going on here? I can see a bike, I can describe a bike to people, but how would I describe this sort of abstract concept called an organisation? So I've been doing a lot of research in the area of brain science, working with an old colleague of mine called Stafford Beer, the late Stafford Beer. He was a cybernetician, and he developed the viable systems model. And the viable systems model really is a model of the brain. But when you think about it, an organisation is more or less doing the same as a brain. We try and prepare for the future, and we'll prepare for the future by understanding our own limitations and constraints, and we'll use that to be able to map out a path of how we're going to unfold in the future. And when you start looking at it in that way, you know, an organisation is doing the same thing. It's starting to be able to look and develop plans that will enable it to survive into the future. So I'm going to slowly introduce the concept of complexity within that concept. So I could argue that the brain is complex. So the model that Stafford developed was based on Reynolds' triune brain theory, where we had the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and the neocortex. The neocortex was the area of rationality. It was where new ideas spawned. We had the limbic system, our emotions, or effectively, from a business perspective, we had the operation. Okay, so the whole system was complex, but it actually comprised of two sort of separate domains. We had the domain of chaos. The chaos was the area where novelty was born. Okay, and we had an audit system, because if you deliver anything to the customer, the last thing you want is variability. So you want order there. So now we've got two types of systems that actually comprise of a complex system, which is an organisation or a person. And these two sort of like subsystems is the area of chaos and an audit system. Okay. So having sort of recognised that a business is sort of can be looked at from these two different perspectives, I can start then getting a bit of understanding of how I can start structuring BT within that overall frame. So if I want to increase the amount of chaos or the amount of creativity, what I want to do is ideas to come together. Ideas need sex. So we don't want asexual reproduction, because that, when it occurs through mutation, I want ideas to come together. I want to share the ideas. So what I want to do is to increase the way that we converse. I want to increase the number of conversations within the business so we can actually transfer memes, mash them together, and get sort of idea complexes.
Steve,
new insights that are taking us forward.
No, one thing I'd like to do later is to actually examine how important understanding of behaviour. We heard in the last session around patient compliance, understanding more about what goes on between the ears of a patient is really, really key. So I want to come back to the behavioural aspects. But one question, simple yes or no. Is it vital to have that level of behavioural understanding before you simplify, or is it a nice to have?
I mean, I would argue, to me, I would think that to me is important, because it creates the framework, bringing the people together to do the simplification.
Great, and we'll come back to that later. The second of the Martins, whenever you ask a question later, just ask it for Martin and you will get 3 for the price of 1. Yeah. Probably different answers, but Martin.
Thank you, Martin. Good afternoon. I'm Martin Price, and I'm Vice President for Health Economics, Market Access and Reimbursement for Janssen in the Europe, Middle East and Africa region. So I've been in pharma for about 20 years, and before that I worked in pharmacy, both in academia and in clinical practice. So my role is very much in struggling and trying to bring the innovative medicines that we deliver to patients as quickly as we can, in a nutshell. And I think if, you asked the question about Health Inc. and is it serving patients, I think if it was a school report, it would be, could do better, I think it's fair to say. And I think from my perspective in the role that I do, unfortunately, it's getting worse as well. It's not getting better. But the good news, I think, is of all my time in working in healthcare, we're on the cusp of an incredibly exciting time for our society, for our patients. The science is truly mind-boggling, and I think we're now, when I came into the industry, we were flogging drugs for stomach ulcers, and now I think we're really in the area of high science, tackling some of the biggest challenges that are facing our society. We're making incredible strides in tackling the hardest to treat cancers with the immunotherapy class and targeted treatments. I think in the next 5 years we'll have genuine disease modifiers in dementia. So we're making incredible progress, and that progress is founded on a model of innovation that has been reliant on the capabilities of the pharmaceutical industry being rewarded for innovation and collaborating with the best scientists. It's been a very, very successful model. But you wouldn't believe it from the kind of public reaction and what you're hearing from politicians. So we have this huge disconnect between what we've achieved and what we can achieve and the kind of adversarial relationship that's evolving. And we should all be very concerned about that. And I think if we look at some of the things that we've achieved, when I joined the industry, HIV was killing people. Within that span of my career, it's now a chronic treatable condition, and people with HIV can expect to live a normal life. And that, again, is this innovation model that we've developed, where we bring medicines, we get recognized for it, we get rewarded for it, and we can plow this money back into developing the treatments of tomorrow. But I think what I've also seen is the process of getting that medicine from development to the patient is getting far more complex. It's getting much more fragmented, and it's getting much more disjointed. So we're now seeing that even after we've got regulatory approval across the region, it can sometimes take 2 years to get a medicine to a patient, because of the reimbursement delays, because of pricing negotiations. And you think of all the health that's lost in that 2-year period. So it's a real problem, and it's going to get worse. And I think the other thing that frustrates me is that some of this complexity is deliberate as well. It's deliberately put in place to actually cost contain, to slow down the uptake of innovation. And some of it happens by design, but some of it is deliberately in there to slow the uptake of innovation. So it's this kind of adversarial relationship that's been developed between the pharmaceutical industry on one side and particularly the payer on the other side. And I think that what we really need to do is that we need more flexibility, number one, in the way that we bring medicines to markets. And in the last session, people were talking about pharmaceutical companies should actually be paid for outcomes, and I firmly believe that we should move to a model where we're rewarded for the health benefits that we deliver, not for the packages we sell. And we're very open to these new models, but what we find in many countries, and I have an international remit, but we're in the UK, so I'll single out the UK, is the UK is a terribly complex and hard place to do business, with very limited flexibility in how we can work together to manage the affordable introduction of new medicines. And I think we need to kind of find a way where we can all sit together and try and figure this out, because the types of products that we're bringing to the market are different, the challenges are different, and the old payment mechanisms of yesterday will not be successful. So we need first of all the willingness of the sides to work together, and I don't see that at the moment. We need a forum to do it, and I don't see that at the moment. And we also need the political will to make this happen, and I don't see that at the moment either. And I think, as I said, the UK is the exemplar of this, and we're making progress in some countries. So for us, for example, Italy is a very flexible place to do business. We can do outcomes-based schemes, we can do flexible reimbursement systems, and we can get access to patients much more effectively. But we need that more generally, and we also need the way value is assessed to come together across different countries, because we can go with the same data package to 3 different countries and we'll get 3 completely different answers on the value of that treatment.
Thanks, Martin. Martin?
Thanks, Martin. And I would point out that actually Gino's got Martin in his name as well,
Yeah.
so that makes 4 out of 6 of us. So this is all becoming a little incestuous. So I'm Martin Gibson, and I'm a clinician. I work in Salford in Manchester. And that's relevant because my hospital, Salford Royal, has been now recognised as the most digitally mature in the NHS. Which makes me worry about the rest, really. But we've been able to build on that, something quite incredible. And I've sat through the last 2 days, and it's been really fascinating for me hearing a very pharma side of things, because obviously I kind of work mainly in the NHS. And I naively, a few years back, thought that the pharmaceutical industry was the most innovative, the most cutting edge, the most forward-thinking group of people. I just assumed that that was the case. And I now realise that it's probably the most conservative set of organisations I've ever come across. So we've been trying to do something differently, and I would take my hat off at this point to GSK, because we've done something with GSK over the last 5 years in Salford called the Salford Lung Study. It's actually 2 studies, and it's not just in Salford, so it's a pretty stupid name. But what we've been doing is quite disruptive, because we've actually taken the clinical trial and pulled it apart. So to use electronic health records to monitor the safety and outcomes of their at the time, pre-licensed medicine. It's now licensed. And this was in respiratory disease. So I won't go through the details, but basically, a patient comes in at day 1, gets signed up to the study, we get permission to share their clinical data, and they come back 12 months later for their final exit visit. It's a phase 3 trial, effectively, and all of the safety monitoring and all of the outcomes monitoring is done by the electronic health records in between. We were the first people to go along to the joint forum of the MHRA and NICE, because we were very concerned that everyone would think we were completely crazy, that we'd never get this off the ground, that the regulators wouldn't agree that we could do the safety monitoring, that the health technology appraisal people would say that's not the kind of evidence we're interested in looking at. And we were very pleasantly surprised. They said, thank goodness somebody's come along to say that kind of thing. Now, they obviously didn't approve it or anything, but it was very refreshing to us, and I think very refreshing to them. So, of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. It turns out that this is a lot harder to do than you might imagine. So having an electronic health record system is obviously necessary, but is certainly not sufficient. And so Northwest eHealth, for which I'm the chief executive, has been building all of the systems that integrate all of those different silos of data. But the NHS has a huge advantage, because we have a unique NHS number, which from a database perspective allows you to bring data from all sorts of different places. I've been over to the FDA. They're very keen to do this kind of thing in the US. Right now it's almost impossible. The same in many parts of Europe. So the UK has actually got a real leading edge here. So in terms of cutting out bureaucracy, you said, is Health Inc. delivering? No. I mean, we know the answer to that. Are there things we could do about it? Yes, we can do this kind of stuff. We really can innovate. We have proven with GSK that we can do this. It's not been easy. It's not been cheap. But you don't need to keep reinventing the wheel. Once you've got this in place, you've got, in our case now, a 650,000 population in this system with real-time safety monitoring. I mean, real-time safety monitoring, not they come to see you at their 3-month checkup and you go, how were you? Oh, I was fine. I've been fine now, doc, but I had a heart attack 3 weeks ago. You get all your bits of paper out and you fill out your serious adverse event report, and you have to report it within 24 hours. This is all automated. This is real time. This allows you to do adaptive trial design. This really gets you to where you need to be in terms of value and value-based outcomes. All the other things that we've been talking about for the last 2 days. We just need to apply it more. I'm a diabetologist. Where Chaz Butcher the other day was talking about all these diseases like Huntington's and cystic, where they haven't had a new drug in ever. In diabetes, we've been really privileged because we've had about 4 or 5 new classes over the last 10, 15 years. And you know what? I still don't know what order to give them to my patients in. I still don't know which patients will benefit the most from any of these drugs. Why is that? Because every single company has done what the regulators have asked them to do, which is just look at HbA1c lowering. I have no idea which is better. I have no idea which affects long-term outcomes. How sad is that?
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Catherine.
Well, obviously I'm not called Martin, and I'm going to give you a slightly different perspective to what's gone before, because I'm more from the operations, the supply side of things. I own a company that helps pharmaceutical companies map their supply chains to find out where they're least resilient and most vulnerable to failure. In my previous life, I used to build plants rather than build models, so something a bit more constructive. I worked for Big Pharma, so I've got a reasonable view of both sides of the fence. So in answer to Martin's question, is Healthcare Inc. succeeding or failing? I'm going to be a bit more balanced in my answer. So I'm going to give it to you from a supply point of view in terms of getting the right product to the right patient at the right time. And I would say yes, Healthcare Inc. is pretty good at getting high-value products to the right patient at the right time. But no, actually, it's pretty bad when it comes to getting the lower-cost, generic, but essential drugs to the right place at the right time. And I think the clue's probably in the statement there. A lot of the reason why there's that disconnect is the value that's given to the drug, that's invested in the supply chain to make it more robust in terms of the high-value product, and unfortunately perhaps slightly less robust in terms of the low-cost generic. So in terms of the question, what must we change? Well, I think attitude to change is one area that really needs looking at. And I'm thinking about change in quite a broad sense, anything from planned, innovative industry changes through to the unwanted, disruptive changes. And if you look at those planned, innovative changes, just to take... The industry struggles, and I think it struggles for a lot of reasons. And I'll go back to my plant engineering days. The last thing I did when I commissioned a tablet plant was to crawl around and install some near-infrared probes into a formulation facility as part of a continuous manufacturing project. And that was 16 years ago. Just recently, I've been very lucky to be involved in a project called Remedies, which is a collaborative project, involves a lot of clever people from a lot of different parts of industry, and some of those people are specialists in continuous manufacturing. And so I asked them, so how have we gone? How have we got on since the 16 years ago when I was crawling around the plant? And the answer was, well, the technology's evolved, but actually, widespread use of continuous manufacture isn't there. And that might be because of the regulators not fully understanding the technology or the impact of the technology, or it might be industry's fear of making a change that regulators don't fully understand. So, and I don't want to go regulator bashing because that's sort of is quite easy in an industry event, but that is all part of the fabric of the industry. Change is difficult because processes are locked down, validated, regulated. So that was my lack of inspiration around innovative change. My other area, which is my current sort of day job, is unplanned change. So companies have got their products approved, they're in the marketplace, they've got a fabulously complex supply chain, multi-stage, multi-country, some pretty exciting technology, but something goes wrong. Something goes wrong in that supply chain. Recovering, generally, if it goes wrong at a point that's unique in some way or capacity constrained, or certainly if it's regulated and there's no alternatives, recovering from those kind of failures can take months, if not years in some instances. So, why are we in this situation? Companies can't invest in totally robust supply chains. They're limited by a number of factors, regulation being one of them, suppliers being sparse in certain areas because of the low volumes that pharmaceutical companies often buy, because of the regulations and pharma clients actually being quite difficult customers. Not, very often, pharma's leverage over those suppliers means having a choice of more than one is often not there. So what can the poor pharma company do? Because actually, strangely, in many instances, when it comes to commodities, components, specialist suppliers, the pharma company might not have that much influence over the supplier. So they can either spend a lot of money trying to make their supply chains more robust and resilient, which perhaps they have the pleasure of doing if they've got a high-value product. But if you're at the other end of the market in the generic, lower cost, need to get the product out the door in the most efficient way possible, that might not be an option. So I'm going to challenge the industry to think collaboratively. And that word has been overly used, I know here, but I'm talking collaboration between competitors, potentially, in areas like supply chain design, where there's a lot of downside risk. So we're not talking about competitive collaboration in competitive areas. We're talking about collaboration to try and fix problems that the whole industry might share. And that would be my challenge. And it happens. This Remedies project is a good example of how academia, different competitors come together to try and solve supply chain solutions.
Quite interesting listening to you have different views on complexity because of your different places in the industry. And what I'd like to do is in the next 10 minutes to really get from each one of you if there is a single cause for complexity, what is it? And what would your remedy be? Single cause and your remedy. I mean, Martin already gave some answers from his perspective, but to give you some thinking time to do this, I'll give you mine. As I said, I spend a lot of time in operations. I spend a lot of time looking at quality systems, most of which are so overcomplicated, they actually present a greater risk to the patient than anything else. And the classic example is SOPs. I spend a lot of time looking at standard operating procedures that neurologically and cognitively are impossible to follow. So a vast majority of companies that I visit have upwards of £40 million worth of assets tied up in a documentation system. Number one, nobody is using. Number two is creating greater risk because of inconsistency. Why? Because they've forgotten what the core purpose of a standard operating procedure is. So for me, one of the causes of complexity is, in this context, companies forgetting that SOP has only one job. And I ask this of clients, what is the purpose of this SOP? And do you know what the answer I get back? It's compliance. We write them for the regulator. We write them for the regulatory auditors to understand. I said, no. There is only one reason you invest that kind of revenue and that effort. It's to drive consistency. So it's how the user uses that SOP, so it's written in a language they can understand. There are more pictures than words, and it better not be more than 3 pages, and it better not require multitasking. So in order to simplify that particular part of your quality system, focus on the core purpose. So for me, my question to the panel is, from your experience in the industry, what is the single biggest cause of complexity, and what would you recommend as a remedy, in other words, to simplify it? So the example I've given is focus on core purpose, and once you focus on core purpose, you deliver for that core purpose. So for the SOPs, it's make sure users can understand it, then you will design something and get them engaged, and you will have a document that people can follow and they will use. So for me, I've got a lot of others, but I'll let any random order, who would like to go first? Single cause of complexity from what you have experienced quickly, and a remedy. And then what I'd like to do is to get your input in the last sort of 5 to 10 minutes to say, in your experience, what is the single cause? What is your remedy? Okay, who would like to go first?
I can give you a single cause, but I'm not sure I have a remedy.
Okay, go for the cause.
Well, I work in the NHS, which is much bigger than most of your organisations.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. it's very big. And it's the size of the organisation that causes the complexity, because you end up with lots of isolation, lots of silos, lots of middle management, all of which the default answer is no. And I see that when I work with large pharma.
Yep.
It's very segmented, it's very siloed. I don't actually know the answer, but we do make it worse through mergers and acquisitions sometimes.
I remember vividly, Martin, I went to GSK's facility outside Paris. It was run at the time by Francis Goldberger, who was the site manager. This was like 20 years ago, and he said, Martin, as soon as you get above 400 people, build another plant. They were the days of, where you could do that, because his view was, and this was a very experienced guy, his view was above that level you can't manage, because the complexity that it creates is one that, exactly what Martin said there. So, Martin, you're pondering there.
Yeah.
What's your...
Well, I'm not sure there is one single cause, but I'll come back to the bit that preoccupies me most in my role and my background, which is the complexity of getting the product from development to the patient. And that's a massive complexity, and it should be the one I think that we're all concerned about. And I think an overriding reason for that is different objectives and different incentives in the system that are not aligned. So it's about this alignment of what we're trying to achieve, number one. One, in this particular area, I think, reflecting on something Martin said, I think for me, one of the opportunities for us is more adaptive and flexible mechanisms through the regulatory pathway. So things like adaptive licensing, I think, are very interesting, where we can have quicker access, we can use different types of data, such as real-world evidence, to help us. But to do that, and why it's failed up till now, is because the regulators, and I think the EMA deserve a lot of credit for kind of championing this approach, is that the regulators are very keen, and there's only one EMA, but there are many different payer organisations. So we have this situation where we can get early access, but people aren't then prepared to pay for it because they don't have the right data on which to base their decisions. So we need to kind of, that's just an example of the complexity, but if we could make adaptive pathways work, I think that would help go some way to reducing that particular element of complexity.
Catherine?
So, there we go. The single cause. In my world of supply chain risk, I guess generally speaking, the problems are built in from day one of the design. So, if you've, and I know the tension in supply chain design is get the drug to market, maximise your profits. If it's at the expense slightly of a slightly less robust process, that's the key point. But if you don't address some of those key issues from the start around resilience, around robustness of the process, then throughout the lifetime of your supply chain, you're always going to be fighting fires, I guess.
Catherine. Steve?
Yeah. Within BT, we have very, very complex processes that actually span many, many business units more. And I think one of the failings is not having the end-to-end management of the entire process. And I think the strategic objective of the original process was lost. So I think the key for us is recognising that all processes is a work in process. So there's always ways of being able to improve it over time. So I think it's also a case of having the end-to-end management, having feedback and learning to ensure that the strategic objective is being met. And I think out of that, it would be obvious that if we can simplify, there'll be opportunities for simplification being identified. So over time, we'll improve the service.
Great, thanks. Gio?
Yeah, I mean, what Martin Gibson was saying about the Salford lung study, I mean, I do take up my hat off what you did. That was a very complex study, because in the group that I'm in, product development, who's actually clinical development, I've been struck at how complex it is just to coordinate clinical trials, get approvals, speak to the KOLs. If you want to set up an advisory board to get a couple of KOLs together, HCP forms that you've got to fill out, to get them around the table, to have a conversation with them, and then to conduct the trials and to recruit the patients. I mean, maybe we're just laborious and old-fashioned, but to me, it's very, very complicated. And, you know, let's put this in context. Development costs twice as much as discovery, and you can see why the cost goes in all that kind of setup and recruiting of the patients and large clinical trials that are required. So that's why we do need to move towards real-world evidence, and certainly work closer with KOLs and certainly with academic centres of excellence, because hopefully we can use real-world data to help us justify some of our files with maybe some less data generated from an RCT. But I was really shocked at some of the work that was done in order to coordinate just a simple clinical trial in a one-study centre. Okay.
I guess now the question for you, you know, we've got 10 minutes or so left. I mean, each one of us has experienced complexity in one shape or size or another. So the question for you is, you know, what have you experienced? What do you think is a cause of the complexity that you've experienced? And to also share either any solutions you found that have worked or, you know, something you'd like to try. So really, the question to the panel is the question to you now. What do you think, in your experience, is one of the biggest causes of complexity? And what's, in your opinion, you'd like to do about it? The floor is yours for the last sort of 5 minutes or so. Any input?
Hi, I'm Sean Robinson at Lonza Biologics. I think it's a misnomer to focus too much on the complexity side, because I think life is complex. Humans, when they get together, are complex. If you try to have a business unit of 20 people all going in the same direction, that's possible. As soon as and I'm speaking about Lonza here, as soon as you have a few hundred people, it's almost impossible to get decisions made. And I think the remedy is not to try to deconstruct the system and have something that's not complex, because I think it will immediately move back to something complex. I think the remedy is to get better at making decisions. And you made the point about middle management. I mean, I think that's the problem. People are scared to make decisions. So why are people scared to make decisions? And what can be done to train people so that they're in a position to make rapid and high quality decisions? And that's when we at Lonza are looking, how can we improve ourselves as a business? That's actually the training programs that we're looking into now, is on decision making.
That's a really good point, Sean. Another question here.
Bill Dawson, I suspect that you've talked about the solution, which is overarching management. But the issue is because most problems occur at the interfaces between different disciplines, between the different branches of the operation that are going to get things done. It's really difficult to communicate, and because as you get promoted up the management tree, then you're really uncomfortable about big picture, and you're really comfortable with the tactical things that you've done well to get promoted. So actually getting people up the tree, able to back off and leave the new people to do the tactical stuff and take the big picture, I think that's the key.
Really good point, Bill. Thank you. Was there a question at the back there? Thank you, Bill.
Hi there. I think if we just get back to the core, which is the products, you know, there's an awful lot of complexity in big pharma, but where we've found success is getting down into the core of the brands, the products. And if you find that you can get some wins in individual products, where you get some product director that wants to make the best of that asset for the company, then everyone else seems to, it seems to spur on quite a bit of positivity about, yes, we can do the same. So I think little wins, but the core is right in the beginning of the product. And I think the way pharma's set up is, you have monolithic functions that hold the budgets. And we're still talking to people in pharma, and I don't hear this outside of pharma, where they tell you how many people they boss and what their budgets are. It's like 19th century talking. So I think when we get to the product, the individual product, and we start looking at that as the asset that needs to be delivered, then I think we're going to get somewhere. I think also the risk, instead of risk shifting from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 and then to the poor reps that are trying to sell something that doesn't differentiate, I think if they basically look at the overall risk of the project, of the asset, as in other businesses, and then you'll be able to de-risk the whole thing with a commercial view for the viability rather than just shifting the blame around.
Thanks very much. Any other comments at all or examples? I think certainly what I would add to that, and it's been mentioned on a few occasions and throughout the session, is our conservatism, it's our risk aversion, our fear of failure, because often that fear of failure leads to a more is better sort of mentality that then leads to the complexity that then paradoxically increases the risk. And to Sean's point also around decision making, I think he's absolutely right. I think the quality of decision making that I see so when I go to companies, usually because they're in trouble, they're suffering from FDA or MHRA, what I'm really interested in is the decision making processes they used to get to the point they've arrived at. And Sean's example, the decision making was pretty poor. So this whole, core competency for me is risk maturity, accepting there is no such thing as zero risk, acknowledging that, getting over our fear of failure so that we don't knee-jerk into compensating for failure by adding stuff, and then make really good risk-based decisions, which you cannot do without profound, in-depth knowledge of your processes, your medicines, and your products. And what I've seen, in my sort of 35 years in the industry, is in operations, and at least, that knowledge of medicines, how they work, key quality attributes, what impacts on absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. People don't know that stuff. They know it as a white pill, and an injectable solution. And without that profound knowledge, you don't have the confidence to manage the risk, which then leads to the complexity. And one thing I'd say, in sort of bringing this to a close, I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to steal with pride. If you want an example of simple thinking, you just got to take one of these things. If you want to see how organizations were structured for simplicity, look at what Apple did. Read about Jobs' obsession with simplicity, with, based to Catherine's point, design for the user day one in the mind of every designer and every programmer. So, it's been an interesting debate. It's going to have to continue, because certainly, hopefully what this has done is to get you thinking about it, because unless we simplify, we won't see that, we can't see where that next punch is coming from. So next time we're on the canvas thinking, where the hell did that one come from? It's our ability to actually spring up really, really quickly and bounce back stronger. In other words, to be nimble and agile, overused terms, because for me, one word does it, and it's simplification. So I'd like to thank the panel, but also I'd like to leave you with another objective for you is, your task really, each one of us has the task to eliminate the unnecessary so that the necessary may speak. Okay, so that's your task. And on that note, that's your call to action. And I'd like you to thank the panel, who are now also running for that last bus or train. So thank you very much indeed, panel.